He had ordered men killed without blinking, burned empires to the ground for less than betrayal. Yet his hand trembled around a porcelain coffee cup. The bakery smelled of butter and sugar too soft, too normal for a man like Dante Ferretti. He sat in the darkest corner, unseen, untouchable, waiting for a meeting that would decide someone else's fate. Then the bell above the door rang. A woman stepped inside. Not just any woman. His pulse spiked before his mind could catch up. The way she walked, the tension in her shoulders, and the instinct to shield. And then he saw the child, 5 years old, dark hair, small hands clutching hers. The boy turned. Gray eyes met gray eyes, and the world narrowed to that single moment. Dante understood the truth instantly, brutally. She hadn't died. She hadn't disappeared. She had run, and she had taken his son with her. Some betrayals demanded blood. This one demanded war. Isabella didn't know she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. All she wanted was the day-old bread tucked into the metal bin at the back of the bakery. The kind sold cheap just before closing. Enough to stretch dinner through tomorrow morning. Enough to quiet her son's hunger without having to explain. Again. Why meat had become an occasional luxury. She told herself they would be in and out before sunset, before the streetlights flickered on and the familiar anxiety tightened around her ribs. She told herself this was just another ordinary evening. She was wrong. The warmth of the bakery wrapped around them as the doorbell chimed, carrying the scent of butter and sugar so thick it almost hurt. Danny's fingers were sticky in her hand, his other palm pressed against the glass display as if the pastries inside were treasures instead of temptations. "Mama, look," he said, his voice bright and careless. "They have dinosaur cookies." Isabella smiled the way she had learned to smile over the years, soft, practiced, a little tired, and promised they would see, even as she calculated how much hope cost. She was bending down to remind him not to touch when the feeling hit her, sharp and unmistakable, like the sudden awareness of a blade at her spine. Someone was watching her, not the casual glance of a stranger, not curiosity. This was something heavier, something that slid under her skin and made her breath catch. Isabella straightened slowly and turned. The man sat in the darkest corner of the bakery, where the overhead light didn't quite reach, his presence at odds with the chipped tiles and the hum of an old refrigerator, broad shoulders, tailored suit, stillness that spoke of control. When his eyes lifted, gray and cold as winter steel. Her body reacted before her mind could stop it. Memory surged, violent and intimate. Dante Ferretti, her ex-husband. The man she had fled from 6 years ago, pregnant and terrified, carrying nothing but a backpack and the certainty that staying would destroy her. She felt her heart slam against her ribs as if trying to escape. Instinct took over. Isabella stepped in front of Danny, angling her body to block the man's line of sight, her hand tightening around her son's. She could feel the tremor she couldn't control, the fine shake that betrayed her fear. Dante didn't move. He didn't smile. He simply watched, his gaze cutting past her and settling on the small figure at her side. Danny, oblivious, craned his neck around her hip. "Mama." He looked from her to the stranger, curiosity winning over caution. "Why is that man looking at you like that?" His eyes met Dante's, and the world shifted. For a fraction of a second, the bakery seemed to fade, leaving only the echoing space between them. Gray eyes met gray eyes, identical in shade, in shape, in that sharp, observant focus that Isabella knew too well. Dante's jaw tightened. Something flickered across his face. Confusion. Then realization so raw it bordered on pain. His fingers curled slowly around the handle of his espresso cup. In Dante's mind, time fractured. He saw the boy's face, the angle of his chin, the familiar stubborn set of his mouth, and a single question roared louder than gunfire ever had. How old is he? The calculation was automatic, merciless. 5. The answer slammed into him with brutal clarity, and beneath it, another thought followed, colder and more dangerous than the first. She had been pregnant when she ran. She had survived, and she had kept his son hidden from him. Dante stood up. The movement drew attention, subtle but decisive. One of the men near the door shifted his stance, outside. A black car eased closer to the curb, its engine idling low. Isabella noticed all of it at once, dread blooming in her chest. She reached for Danny, ready to run, but the exits had already been claimed. Dante took a step forward, his presence filling the space between them, and for a moment the years collapsed. She remembered his voice in the dark, his hand at the back of her neck, the way he had promised protection while slowly taking away her air. "I think you have me confused with someone else," she said, the lie thin and trembling on her tongue. Dante stopped just out of reach. His eyes dropped to Danny again, and Isabella watched something in him fracture. The control she had once feared cracking under the weight of truth. He didn't call her by name. Not yet. He didn't need to. The boy shifted closer to her leg, sensing the tension. His small fingers fisting in her coat. "How old?" Dante asked quietly, and the sound of his voice sent a chill down her spine. She didn't answer. Danny did. "I'm 5.5, he said with pride. "My birthday was in June." The words hit Dante like a verdict. His mouth pressed into a thin line as fury burned behind his eyes, sharp and restrained. Around them, the bakery's ordinary sounds faltered. Someone stopped humming behind the counter. A woman at a nearby table froze, hands hovering over her laptop. Glass shattered without warning. The explosion of sound was deafening, a violent interruption that turned confusion into chaos. Isabella screamed as Dante lunged forward, not toward her, but over her, his body shielding hers as they were driven to the floor. Gunfire followed, sharp and relentless, ripping through the warm air of the bakery. Screams erupted, chairs toppled. Dante's hand pressed firmly against the back of her head, forcing her down. "Stay down," he growled near her ear, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Don't let him see," somewhere nearby. Danny cried out, and Isabella's heart tore in two. Men shouted in Italian. The smell of gunpowder burned her throat. Dante moved with lethal precision, issuing commands, returning fire, his world reasserting itself in blood and noise. Isabella clutched the floor, every instinct screaming to reach her son, but she felt Dante's grip tighten, anchoring her in place even as terror consumed her. In that moment, the truth settled over her with crushing force. The man she had spent 6 years running from was the only thing standing between her child and death. Minutes later, they were dragged through the back door into the cold, thrown into the waiting car. The city blurred past as the engine roared to life. Danny was placed in her arms, shaken but alive, his small body trembling against her chest. Isabella pressed her lips to his hair, whispering reassurances she barely believed. Dante sat across from them, blood on his cuff, his gaze never leaving the boy's face. The war he had spent years fighting without mercy had just become personal. By the time the iron gates of his estate loomed ahead, Isabella knew there would be no returning to the life she had built. She had been seen. Her son had been seen. And Dante Ferretti never let go of what belonged to him. As the car slowed and the gates began to open, Isabella closed her eyes, holding Danny tighter, understanding with devastating clarity that the quiet, fragile freedom she had protected for so long had just ended. If this story touched your heart, follow the channel to enjoy many more heart-stirring stories every week. Isabella lied. The words left her mouth automatically. Born of instinct rather than thought, and 6 years of hiding had taught her how to lie without blinking. How to sound convincing even when terror clawed at her throat. "You're mistaken," she said, forcing her voice into calm. "You have the wrong person." She didn't look at Dante when she said it. She couldn't afford to. Looking at him was dangerous. Looking at him meant remembering how easily he could see through her. Dante smiled. It was not a warm smile. Not one meant to reassure. It was the kind of smile worn by men who had watched entire worlds collapse at their feet and felt nothing but mild interest. Slow, controlled, sharp at the edges, the smile of a predator who had just confirmed that his prey was, indeed, trapped. He stepped closer, not touching her, not invading her space in any obvious way. Yet, Isabella's lungs refused to draw a full breath. His presence pressed in on her, heavy and undeniable. dragging old memories to the surface like bodies pulled from deep water. "You haven't changed," he said softly. "Still lying when you're afraid." Her heart pounded. She shifted subtly, placing herself more firmly between him and Danny, one hand tightening around her son's small fingers. She could feel the faint tremble in him now, the instinctive unease children sensed before adults admitted danger. Dante's eyes dropped, just for a moment, to that small hand gripping hers. His expression didn't change, but something in the air sharpened. "How old is he?" Dante asked. The question was quiet, casual, almost. It terrified her more than a shout ever could. Isabella opened her mouth to speak, already forming another lie. Something vague, something safe, but Danny beat her to it, his voice cutting through the tension with innocent pride. "I'm 5.5, he said. "My birthday was in June." The world stopped. Isabella felt at the precise instant everything froze. As if time itself had been held by an unseen hand, Dante didn't move. He didn't blink. His gaze locked onto Danny's face. And Isabella watched understanding dawn with brutal speed. She saw the calculation behind his eyes, the mental arithmetic he could never turn off. 5.5 in June. The dates aligned with merciless precision, forming a truth that no lie could dismantle. Dante inhaled slowly. So, she had been pregnant, and she had run anyway. The realization hit him harder than any betrayal he could remember. Not because she had left, he had always known she was capable of that, but because she had taken something from him, something he hadn't even known existed. His jaw clenched, teeth grinding as fury and something dangerously close to awe collided in his chest. A son, his son, standing right there, looking at him with eyes that mirrored his own. Isabella felt the shift before she understood it. The atmosphere changed, thickening with tension so dense it felt like pressure against her skin. The elderly couple at the corner table stopped eating. The woman with the laptop froze mid-keystroke. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed too loud, too fragile for what was about to happen. The sound of shattering glass exploded through the bakery. Isabella screamed as a bullet tore through the front window, sending shards spraying across the tiled floor. Chaos erupted instantly. People shouted, chairs scraped and toppled. Another shot rang out, closer this time, followed by a third. The smell of gunpowder burned through the sweetness of butter and sugar, turning the air acrid and violent. Before Isabella could move, Dante was on her. His body slammed her to the floor, one arm braced over her head, shielding her as glass rained down around them. She felt the solid weight of him, unyielding, terrifyingly strong. His other hand moved with lethal efficiency, drawing a gun from beneath his jacket as if it were an extension of his body. Isabella's mind struggled to keep up. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening here. In a bakery. In a place meant for warmth and comfort. "Stay down," Dante growled, his voice low and commanding near her ear. "Do not move." She wanted to fight him, to claw her way free and run to her son, but fear rooted her to the floor. Dante shifted slightly, angling his body to block her view as another shot cracked through the air. "Don't look," he said, harsher now. "Don't let him see." Danny cried out from somewhere nearby, a thin, terrified sound that sliced through her. Isabella tried to rise, panic tearing at her chest. "My son," she gasped, her nails digging into Dante's sleeve. "Danny, he's safe," Dante said. Even as he fired, the recoil vibrating through his arm. "Marco has him." Isabella didn't know who Marco was, but she saw the truth of Dante's words moments later. One of his men dragged Danny behind the counter, crouching low as bullets tore through display cases and walls. The man covered Danny's head with his own body, shielding him without hesitation. The sight shattered something inside her. She pressed her face to the floor, tears blurring her vision, her heart breaking and hardening at the same time. The bakery was no longer a bakery. It was a battlefield. Dante barked orders in Italian, sharp and precise. His men moved with terrifying coordination, weapons appearing from beneath jackets, their calm efficiency at odds with the screaming civilians scrambling for cover. Isabella lay pinned beneath Dante's protective weight, every nerve screaming, Her senses overwhelmed by noise and fear and the impossible knowledge that the man she had spent years running from was now the only reason she and her child were still alive. Minutes stretched like hours. The gunfire finally slowed, then stopped. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. But Dante didn't relax. He scanned the room one last time before lowering his weapon. His breathing steady despite the chaos he had just commanded. Only then did he look down at Isabella. For a moment, their eyes met. She saw something there she had never seen before. Not anger, not cruelty, something raw and unguarded, flickering beneath the surface of his control. Possession. Yes, but also relief. Fear, quickly buried, the kind of fear that came only when something precious had nearly been taken. "You shouldn't have brought him here," Dante said quietly. "You shouldn't have been here at all," she shot back, her voice breaking. "This is your world, your violence." "And now," he replied, helping her to her feet without letting go. "It's touching my son," and the words settled between them like a verdict. Isabella realized the truth with devastating clarity. Dante hadn't just found her. He hadn't just discovered his child. His enemies had seen them too, and that meant there was no corner of the world far enough, no shadow deep enough, to hide in anymore. As his men secured the exits and ushered terrified patrons outside, Dante turned back to her, his hand firm at her elbow. "We're leaving," he said. "No," Isabella whispered, clutching Danny as he was placed back into her arms. "We're not going anywhere with you." Dante's gaze dropped to the boy, then lifted back to her face, steel hard. "You already are." As they were hurried toward the waiting car, Isabella pressed her lips to Danny's hair, silent tears soaking into his curls. She wasn't crying because she had nearly died. She was crying because she understood now what she had refused to accept for 6 years. Dante Ferretti had never let her go. He had only been waiting to find her again. The SUV tore through the city like a living thing, engine growling as it swallowed street after street. Isabella sat rigid in the back seat, Danny pressed tightly to her chest, her arms locked around him as if she could shield him from the world by force alone. His small body trembled with aftershock, his fingers clutching her coat, burying his face against her collarbone. She whispered to him without words, her lips brushing his hair, her heart still racing too fast to slow. Across from them, Dante sat in silence, one hand braced on his knee, the other resting loosely near his weapon. His gaze never left the boy, not for a second. The city lights thinned, replaced by darkness and trees. The road curved sharply, climbing, and then the iron gates appeared, massive and unforgiving, rising out of the night like the mouth of a beast. Cameras tracked the vehicle as it approached. The gates opened without hesitation. Isabella felt something inside her sink as they passed through. There was no mistaking it. This was not a home. It was a fortress. The estate emerged gradually. Stone and glass woven together with cold precision, lights glowed softly from within, warm and deceptive, illuminating manicured grounds that looked untouched by the violence of the outside world. The SUV rolled to a stop beneath a covered entrance. Before Isabella could move, Dante was already out of the car, circling around to her door. He opened it and reached in, his hands hovering for half a second before settling beneath Danny's weight. He lifted the boy carefully, awkwardly, as if afraid of doing it wrong. "I can carry him," Dante said quietly. Isabella hesitated. Every instinct screamed to refuse, to keep her child in her arms where she could feel his heartbeat. But Danny shifted, exhaustion finally claiming him, his head lolling against Dante's shoulder with a soft, unconscious trust that sliced straight through her defenses. Dante adjusted his grip immediately, supporting the boy's neck, his movements slow and deliberate, watching him. Isabella felt something dangerous loosen inside her. This was the first time Dante had ever held his son, and he looked like a man handling something infinitely fragile. "This isn't my house," Isabella said as she stepped out of the car, her voice hoarse. "This is not my home." Dante glanced back at her. "It is now," he replied evenly. "It's our home." She followed him inside because there was nowhere else to go. The foyer swallowed them whole. Marble floors gleaming beneath towering ceilings, a chandelier casting fractured light across walls lined with art she couldn't begin to name. Everything was beautiful. Everything was too much. A woman appeared almost instantly. Middle-aged, composed, her dark hair pulled back neatly. She froze for just a second when she saw the child in Dante's arms, then recovered. "Prepare the East Wing," Dante said, "and call the doctor." "Yes, sir," the woman replied, already moving. They climbed the stairs, Dante carrying Danny as if he'd done it 1,000 times, though Isabella could see the careful tension in his arms. The room he brought them to stopped her breath. It was clearly meant for a child, not hastily arranged, not improvised. A bed shaped like a race car sat against one wall, shelves filled with books and toys lining another. Stuffed animals were arranged with unnatural neatness, as if waiting for permission to be touched. Isabella turned slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. "You prepared this," she said. Dante laid Danny gently on the bed, pulling a blanket over him with surprising tenderness. "Yes." "How long?" Her voice sharpened. "How long have you known?" Dante straightened, finally looking at her fully. 3 months. The word struck harder than any blow. 3 months, she repeated. "You knew where we were. I knew where you were." He confirmed. "I watched." Her hands curled into fists. "And you did nothing. I waited." He corrected. "Until you ran out of places to run." The sound of her palm against his cheek echoed sharply through the room. Dante didn't flinch. His head turned slightly with the force, then stilled. He looked back at her. Eyes dark, expression unreadable. Isabella's chest heaved, fury and fear crashing together until she could barely tell them apart. "I will never forgive you," she said, her voice breaking. "For this, for trapping us." "I don't need your forgiveness," Dante replied quietly. "I need you here. You don't get to decide that," she snapped. "I already have." The doctor arrived, interrupting the moment before it could shatter completely. Danny was examined first, declared unharmed, merely shaken and exhausted. Isabella barely registered her own inspection. The shallow cut on her arm, the glass tangled in her hair, her attention never left her son. Dante stood nearby the entire time, silent, watchful, a shadow that refused to recede. Later, when Danny slept deeply, his breathing even and slow, Isabella found herself standing alone in the hallway with Dante. The house was eerily quiet, insulated from the world beyond its walls. She crossed her arms, grounding herself. "This doesn't end the war," she said. "You know that." "No," Dante agreed. "It brings it closer. And us," she demanded. "What happens to us?" He studied her for a long moment, as if weighing truths he rarely spoke aloud. "Outside these walls," he said finally, "my enemies would use him to destroy me. They would use you. Here, they won't touch either of you." "And the price?" Isabella asked. Dante's gaze hardened. "You stay." The simplicity of it stole her breath. There were no lies in his voice, no attempt to soften the truth. She realized then that this house, with all its beauty and protection, was exactly what it appeared to be, a sanctuary built from steel and blood, a place no one could escape, outside, somewhere far beyond the gates. Engines roared and phones rang. Men moved pieces across a board she couldn't see. The war Dante lived in was still raging, unseen but relentless. Inside the estate, another battle had begun, quieter and far more dangerous. One fought not with bullets, but with control, love, and the fragile, terrifying bond of a family forced back together. Isabella returned to Danny's room and sat beside his bed, brushing her fingers through his hair as he slept. She looked around at the toys, the careful preparations, the life that had been waiting for him without her consent. Her chest tightened. Dante stood in the doorway, watching them both, his expression softened by something that looked dangerously like devotion. In that moment, Isabella understood the truth she had been avoiding since the bakery. She and her son had crossed a threshold they could not uncross. There were no doors here that led back to the life she had built, no windows wide enough to climb through, only walls meant to keep danger out and keep them in. and in the quiet between heartbeats, she realized this house didn't need locks, because none of them were leaving. Isabella did not beg. She had learned long ago that pleading only handed power to the wrong people. Power was taken, or it was negotiated. And if there was one thing Dante Ferretti understood, it was negotiation. She waited until the house settled into its false quiet, until the night guards had taken their posts and the soft hum of security systems faded into the background. Danny slept down the hall, cocooned in silk sheets and borrowed safety. Only then did she seek Dante out. He was in his study, a room carved from dark wood and shadow, maps and screens glowing softly along one wall. The faint smell of whiskey hung in the air. He looked up when she entered, his expression already guarded. As if he sensed what was coming, Isabella closed the door behind her and stood her ground, spine straight, hands steady. Fear still lived in her chest, but it no longer ruled her. "We need to talk," she said. Dante gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "We already are." She ignored the invitation and remained standing. "This isn't about what you want," she continued. "It's about what will happen if we stay." A flicker of irritation crossed his face, quickly masked. "You are staying. That part isn't negotiable." She agreed. "Everything else is..." His gaze sharpened, interest stirring beneath the steel. He leaned back slightly, folding his hands. "Go on." Isabella drew a breath. "First," she said, her voice firm, "Danny does not enter your world. Ever. No guns. No meetings. No men teaching him how to survive in violence instead of how to live without it. He will not grow up thinking blood is normal." Dante's jaw tightened. "You don't get to pretend that world doesn't exist," he said. "I get to decide what my son sees," Isabella shot back. "He didn't choose this life." "You did." Silence stretched between them. Dante's eyes flicked toward the door, the direction of Danny's room, before returning to her face. "Continue." "Second," she said, pressing on. "I need a job, a real one, something that's mine. I will not sit in this house waiting for you to decide my schedule, my worth, my future." A muscle jumped in his cheek. "You don't need to work. That's not your decision," Isabella replied. "If I'm going to stay, I will not disappear into your shadow." He studied her, truly studied her, as if seeing the woman she had become rather than the one he remembered. There was something unsettling in his gaze, something that bordered on admiration. "And the third?" he asked. She didn't hesitate. "You do not make decisions for me without me. Not about Danny. Not about my life. I will not be managed." The word lingered in the air, sharp and deliberate. Dante was very still now, for a long moment. Isabella thought she might have pushed too far. She braced herself for anger, for refusal, for the cold reminder that he held all the cards. Instead, he remained silent, his eyes dropping to the desk, his fingers tapping once against the polished surface. Minutes passed. When he finally looked up, something had shifted. The dominance was still there, unmistakable, but it was tempered by something heavier, something like restraint. Dante nodded once. Agreed. The single word stunned her. All of it, she asked quietly. All of it. He confirmed. "Danny stays out of my operations. You work, and decisions concerning you and my son are made together." Relief flooded her so suddenly it left her dizzy, but it didn't last. Dante rose from his chair, circling the desk until he stood in front of her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him. "There is one condition of my own," he said. Her shoulders tensed. "What you don't leave this estate," Dante said calmly. "Not without my knowledge. Not without protection." Isabella laughed, sharp and humorless. "So this is a prison?" "No," Dante replied. "A prison is where people are kept to be broken. This is the only place no one would dare touch our child. Our child." The word struck her harder than any threat. She searched his face, looking for manipulation, for lies. What she found instead was fear, raw and tightly controlled. The kind of fear men like Dante rarely allowed themselves to feel, let alone show. Fear of loss, fear of vulnerability, fear of a small boy sleeping down the hall, utterly unaware of the world waiting beyond the gates. "You're afraid," Isabella said softly. Dante didn't deny it. "I have enemies who would trade their lives to hurt me," he said. "They would do it through him if they could. And you think I don't know that," she whispered. "I ran because I was afraid of this world, of you, but I never stopped protecting him." "I know," Dante said, his voice lowered. "That's why he's alive." The admission hung between them, intimate and dangerous. Isabella realized then that Dante's power, vast as it was, meant nothing against the thought of losing his son. He would burn cities to prevent it. He would cage the people he loved to keep them breathing. In his mind, protection and control were indistinguishable. "I'll stay," Isabella said finally, "on my terms." Dante's hand lifted, hesitating for the briefest moment before resting lightly against her arm. The touch was careful, almost reverent, as if he were afraid of breaking something fragile. "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said. She didn't pull away, but she didn't lean into him either. The balance they had struck was precarious, built on conditions and unspoken truths. As she turned to leave, Isabella glanced back at him, seeing not the tyrant of the underworld, but a man standing on unfamiliar ground, negotiating with a woman who refused to be owned. Later that night, Isabella sat beside Danny's bed, watching him sleep. The house was silent again, the illusion of peace settling over the estate. She brushed a kiss over her son's forehead, her chest tight with love and fear in equal measure. Dante stood in the doorway, unseen by Danny, his presence a dark silhouette against the hall light. In that moment, Isabella understood the most dangerous truth of all. Dante Ferretti did not fear losing his empire. He feared losing his child. And a man like that would do anything, absolutely anything, to make sure it never happened. Danny adapted faster than Isabella was ready for, within days. The shadows beneath his eyes faded. He slept through the night without waking from nightmares. His small body no longer curled tight in instinctive defense. He laughed more soft at first, then freely, the sound ringing through the vast house as if it had been waiting for him in the estate. Once cold and imposing, seemed to shift around his presence, becoming warmer, almost alive. Isabella watched it happen with a tightening chest, love and fear twisting together until she could no longer tell them apart. He had a father now. Not a distant name, not a dangerous absence, but a man who appeared every morning without fail. Dante made space for him in ways Isabella hadn't anticipated. He ate breakfast with Danny when he could, listening more than he spoke. He knelt to the child's height when they talked. He learned quickly what Danny liked, what frightened him, what made his eyes light up with curiosity. Isabella saw the care in those small details, and it unsettled her more than Dante's violence ever had. She found them one afternoon in the sunroom, the long windows open to the garden. A chessboard sat between them on the low table. Dante was explaining the rules slowly, patiently, his voice stripped of its usual edge. "This one moves like this," he said, guiding Danny's fingers across the board. "But it's not about rushing. It's about thinking ahead." Danny nodded solemnly, brow furrowed in concentration, his tongue peeking out at the corner of his mouth. Isabella stood in the doorway, unseen. She watched her son laugh when he captured Dante's piece, watched Dante smile, really smile in response. It was a quiet, private expression, one she had rarely seen even during their marriage. Something sharp lodged itself beneath her ribs. She had wanted Danny to be happy. She just hadn't expected it to look like this. Later that week, Dante took Danny to the indoor pool. Isabella hovered at the edge, arms crossed tightly over her chest as she watched Dante guide her son into the water. Danny clung to him at first, his fingers digging into Dante's shoulders, fear flickering across his face. Dante didn't rush him. He didn't push. He held Danny close and spoke softly, steady and sure. "You don't need to be afraid," Dante said. "I've got you." The words landed like a blow. Isabella felt them echo inside her, heavier than they had any right to be. Danny loosened his grip, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. By the end of the hour, he was laughing again, splashing water toward the edge, calling for his mother to look. "Mama, watch me," he shouted, pride swelling in his voice. She waved back, forcing a smile she didn't feel. Each step Danny took toward Dante felt like a step away from her. At night, when the house finally quieted, Isabella lay awake, listening to the distant hum of security. The faint murmur of guards changing shifts. Dante slept elsewhere, giving her space, honoring the boundaries she had demanded. But his presence was everywhere in the walls, in the routines forming around Danny, in the sense of safety that had begun to settle over the estate. She hated herself for acknowledging it, but the truth was undeniable. Here, her son was not hungry. He was not afraid. He was protected, and that terrified her. She feared the day Danny would look at his father and see not just comfort, but belonging. She feared the subtle ways the world might shape him, the way strength and power could become seductive. She feared that no matter how fiercely she guarded him, Dante's world would eventually bleed through the cracks. "You're quiet," Dante observed one evening as they stood on opposite sides of the kitchen island. Danny was already asleep upstairs, the soft glow of his nightlight spilling into the hallway. Isabella busied herself with wiping down a spotless counter, anything to avoid meeting Dante's gaze. "I'm thinking," she replied, "that usually means trouble." He said lightly. She looked up then, meeting his eyes. "You're changing him." Dante didn't bristle. He didn't deny it. He considered her words carefully before responding. "I'm helping him feel safe." "And what happens when he starts asking questions?" Isabella pressed. "About who you are, about what you do. I won't lie to him," Dante said, "but I won't drag him into it either. You have my word." His word. Once. That had been everything. She studied his face, searching for cracks, for arrogance, for the familiar certainty that he could control any outcome. What she saw instead unsettled her more. He looked cautious, measured, as if he understood how fragile this balance was. "He already looks at you differently," she said quietly. Dante's expression softened. "He looks at me like a child looks at someone who shows up." The simplicity of the statement undid her. Isabella turned away, blinking rapidly. She remembered nights alone with a crying infant, the weight of exhaustion pressing her into the mattress, the promises she had whispered into the dark. "I'll protect you. I'll be enough." Now she wasn't sure she ever had been. Days blurred into weeks. Danny's routine settled. He read before bed, sprawled across pillows with a book nearly too big for his hands. He ran through the halls, his laughter echoing off marble and glass. He learned to play chess, to swim, to breathe through fear instead of freezing beneath it. Dante was there for all of it, steady and present, carving out space in his dangerous life for something soft. Isabella stood between them, caught in the quiet war she had never intended to fight. She loved her son fiercely. She distrusted the man giving him so much joy, some nights. She watched them together and felt an ache so sharp it stole her breath. Other nights. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long she could hold the line she had drawn. One evening, she found Danny sitting beside Dante in the study, the chessboard abandoned. Danny's head resting against his father's arm. Dante was telling him a story not about crime or power, but about the ocean, about learning to swim when he was young, about fear and courage and choosing to move forward anyway. Danny listened, rapt, his small hand curled into Dante's sleeve. Isabella paused in the doorway, unseen once more. For the first time, she allowed herself to admit the truth she had been resisting. Dante was not just teaching her son how to survive. He was teaching him how not to be afraid, and as much as that frightened her, it also filled her with a reluctant, aching gratitude. Still, the fear remained, because she knew that loving someone like Dante Ferretti always came with a cost. And standing between a father and his son was a battle she might not win. The first sign came quietly, a phone call cut short, a meeting moved forward without explanation. Guards doubled at the gates, their movements sharper, their eyes more alert. Isabella noticed the change the way one notices a shift in the weather instinctively, with a tightening in her chest. Dante said nothing. He didn't need to. Violence had its own language, and she had learned enough of it to recognize when it was being spoken nearby. The estate felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Danny was kept inside more often. His lessons continued. His laughter still echoed through the halls, but Isabella sensed the careful orchestration beneath it all. Dante appeared less during the day, slipping away before dawn and returning long after Danny had gone to sleep. When he did come back, there was a new stillness to him, a quiet intensity that made Isabella's skin prickle. She didn't ask questions, not at first. She had spent years running from the truth, from Dante, from the world he ruled. Now she found herself watching the gates each evening, counting the minutes until his car appeared, her heart betraying her long before her mind caught up. When he finally returned one night, close to morning, Isabella was waiting in the kitchen, the lights dim, the coffee cold in her untouched cup. Dante stopped when he saw her. "You should be asleep," he said. "So should you," she replied. His gaze flicked over her face, as if checking for fear, for accusation. Finding neither, he relaxed just a fraction. He moved past her to pour himself a drink, his movements precise, economical. Isabella noticed the faint smear of blood at his cuff before he had a chance to change. The sight made her stomach turn. "Is it over?" she asked quietly. Dante's hand paused on the glass. "It will be. That was enough." Isabella understood what those words meant. Someone had crossed a line. Someone had looked too closely at what belonged to Dante Ferretti. And Dante had responded the only way he ever did. The enemy disappeared within days. No headlines, no arrests, just whispers that stopped mid-sentence, names that were no longer spoken. Isabella heard it in fragments from the tension easing among the guards, from the sudden calm that settled over the house like dust after a storm. She knew better than to ask for details. She didn't need them. Blood had been spilled. She could feel it in the quiet. And for the first time, she didn't run. The realization came slowly, unsettling her more than the danger itself. She stayed. She continued her routines with Danny. She made breakfast. She read him stories. She laughed when he laughed. All the while, the knowledge sat heavy in her chest. Dante had killed again. And this time, it had been for them. They spoke about it days later, in the early hours of the morning when the house was asleep and honesty had a way of slipping through the cracks. Dante stood at the window of his study, the city lights distant and cold beyond the glass. Isabella leaned against the desk, her arms wrapped around herself, gathering the courage she hadn't realized she would need. "You did this because of us," she said. Dante didn't turn around. "I did this because of him," he corrected. After a beat, he added, "And because of you," and the words landed softly, devastating in their simplicity. Isabella closed her eyes. She had asked herself that question so many times in silence, afraid of the answer. Hearing it spoken aloud changed something fundamental between them. It stripped away illusion and left only truth. "This is your solution to everything," she said. Not accusing, not forgiving, just stating a fact. Blood. "It's the only language my enemies respect," Dante replied. "And the only one that keeps my family alive. Family." He said it as if it were already settled, as if there were no room left for doubt. Isabella felt the weight of that word press against her ribs. Loving him, she realized, meant accepting the cost that came with his protection. It meant understanding that safety, in his world, was never clean. "I won't pretend this doesn't scare me," she said softly. "I don't want you to." Dante answered. He finally turned to face her. Up close, she could see the exhaustion etched into his features, the faint shadow beneath his eyes. Fear keeps you alive. It keeps him alive. "And what about you?" she asked. "What does it do to you?" He was silent for a long moment. Then, quietly, "It reminds me of what I can't afford to lose." Isabella studied him, really studied him, seeing past the power and the control to the man standing in front of her. A man shaped by violence. Yes, but also by devotion fierce enough to burn entire worlds to ash. She understood then that loving Dante Ferretti was not a choice made lightly. It was a commitment to stand beside someone who would never stop fighting, even when the fight demanded blood. Days passed, the tension easing, life resuming its careful rhythm. Dante was home more often again. He watched Danny play, listened to his stories, helped with homework he barely understood but approached with seriousness all the same. Isabella observed it all, the softness he reserved only for his son, the way his hand hovered at Danny's back as if ready to shield him from anything. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the estate in gold, Isabella found herself standing beside Dante on the terrace, watching Danny chase a ball across the lawn, and the boy's laughter drifted toward them, unburdened and bright. Isabella felt a swell of emotion she didn't try to suppress. "You could have sent us away," she said, "hidden us somewhere else. You didn't have to do this." Dante's gaze followed their son. Running only delays the inevitable. He said, "I don't delay threats. I end them." She nodded slowly. "And if one day the blood reaches us," Dante turned to her then, his expression unyielding, "it won't." The certainty in his voice sent a shiver through her. Isabella understood that promise for what it was: not hope, not denial, but a vow carved into something unbreakable. Dante Ferretti would destroy anything that threatened his family, including himself if it came to that. Later that night, as she lay awake, Isabella stared at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the house. She thought of the life she had tried to build alone, the safety she had chased across cities and borders. She thought of the blood that now stained the foundation of this new reality. She didn't run. Instead, she reached out across the space between their beds and rested her hand against Dante's arm. He stilled, then turned toward her, surprise flickering briefly before something softer replaced it. He covered her hand with his own, his grip firm, grounding. In that quiet moment, Isabella accepted the truth she could no longer deny. Loving Dante meant living with the consequences of his love. It meant understanding that his protection was written in blood, and choosing, despite everything, to stay outside. The world remained dangerous and unforgiving. Inside, a family held together by fierce devotion and unspoken compromises slept under the same roof. And for the first time since the bakery, Isabella allowed herself to believe that she could survive this not by running, but by standing her ground beside the man who would burn the world to keep them safe. Peace arrived quietly, almost deceptively. It settled into the house through routine rather than promise, through repetition instead of reassurance. Dinners were eaten together at the long table beneath warm lights, Danny chattering about schoolwork and chess strategies, his stories filling the spaces where tension once lived. Dante listened more than he spoke, cutting his food with deliberate care, occasionally correcting Danny's posture or offering a rare smile that made the boy glow with pride. Isabella watched from across the table, absorbing the scene with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. If someone had shown her this image months ago, she would have laughed at its impossibility. The nights were quieter than she expected. They slept in separate rooms, a choice unspoken yet mutually respected. There were no accidental brushes of skin, no shared sheets, no whispered confessions in the dark. Instead, there were glances held a second too long, conversations cut short when they strayed too close to dangerous ground. Isabella would catch Dante watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, his gaze heavy with things he didn't voice. She returned those looks more often than she admitted to herself, her heart responding before her caution could intervene. They were a family, in all the ways that mattered to Danny. They were not lovers, and the line between those two truths was thin and carefully guarded. Isabella told herself it was safer that way. Desire complicated things. Intimacy demanded vulnerability, and vulnerability was a luxury neither of them could afford. Still, there were moments, small, almost invisible ones, when the illusion wavered. Dante brushing past her in the hallway, his hand hovering near her waist without touching. Isabella catching the faint scent of his cologne and feeling something tighten low in her chest. The tension lived in the spaces between them, unspoken but alive. Days passed, then weeks, and the estate remained calm, guarded but unthreatened. Danny flourished, his confidence growing with every passing day. He called Dante Dad now, the word slipping into conversation so naturally it made Isabella's breath catch every time. Dante pretended not to notice when it happened, but Isabella saw the way his shoulders squared, the way his jaw softened just a fraction. He was becoming something new, something dangerous in its own right. One evening, Isabella lingered in the kitchen after dinner, rinsing plates already clean. Dante leaned against the counter across from her, arms crossed, watching her with that quiet intensity she had come to recognize. "You don't have to keep busy," he said. She shrugged. "It helps me think." "About what?" She met his gaze. "About how long this can last." The question hung between them, fragile and honest. Dante didn't dismiss it. "Longer than you think," he said. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust the calm, to accept it as real rather than borrowed time. But peace, she knew, was never permanent in Dante's world. It was an intermission, not an ending. The call came late, shattering the stillness like glass. Isabella was halfway up the stairs when she heard Dante's phone ring. She froze. Every instinct flaring, he answered quietly, turning away. His voice low and controlled. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the change in him immediately, the way his posture sharpened, the way the air around him seemed to tighten. When he hung up, he was already moving. "I'll be back," he said. When she asked, "Soon?" It was the same promise he always made. This time, it rang hollow. Hours passed. The house fell silent. Danny asleep upstairs, the guards shifting restlessly outside. Isabella paced the floor, her thoughts spiraling despite her efforts to remain calm. She told herself Dante had faced worse. She told herself he was prepared, protected, impossible to kill. None of it eased the ache in her chest. The sound of tires on gravel finally broke the silence. Isabella reached the front hall just as the doors flew open. Men poured in, voices urgent, movements frantic. Dante was between them, half supported, his shirt soaked red. For a moment, Isabella couldn't breathe. The world narrowed to that single, horrifying image. She rushed forward, her hand shaking as she touched him, needing proof that he was still solid, still there. "It's not bad," Dante said through clenched teeth, even as blood seeped through his fingers. "I've had worse." She ignored him, shouting for the doctor, her voice sharp with fear she no longer bothered to hide. As they guided him toward the sitting room, Isabella stayed close, her hand gripping his arm with desperate strength, her heart hammered against her ribs. Each beat a reminder of how close she had come to losing him without ever admitting what he meant to her. The doctor worked quickly, efficiently. The wound was deep, but not fatal. A bullet had grazed Dante's side, missing anything vital by a narrow margin. Isabella stood nearby, arms wrapped around herself, watching as the man she had once feared more than death lay vulnerable beneath harsh light. When it was over and the room cleared, she remained. Dante met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have seen that," he said quietly. "I needed to," she replied. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths. Isabella realized then, with startling clarity, that the fear clawing at her chest had nothing to do with Dante's danger. She had never been afraid of his world, not truly. What terrified her was the thought of waking up one day without him in it, of explaining absence to a child who trusted too deeply, of returning to a life where his presence was only memory. "I don't fear what you are," she said softly. "I fear losing you," and the admission settled like a confession. Dante studied her face, something raw flickering behind his eyes before he masked it. He reached for her hand, stopping just short, as if waiting for permission he wasn't sure he deserved. She closed the distance herself, their fingers intertwining, grounding them both. "I came back," he said. "I always will." She squeezed his hand, tears blurring her vision. "Just don't make me prove how much that matters again." He nodded once, solemn. In that moment, the illusion of peace shattered, replaced by something more honest, more fragile, and far more dangerous. They were not lovers, not yet, but they were no longer pretending that their bond was anything less than essential. Outside, the night pressed in, full of threats waiting patiently for their turn. Inside, Two people stood at the edge of something they could no longer ignore, knowing that peace was temporary, but love, once acknowledged, was irrevocable. The offer came without drama. No raised voice, no demand, no threat disguised as protection. Dante waited until the house had settled again, until Danny was asleep and the echoes of fear from the recent attack had faded into something quieter, more reflective. He found Isabella in the garden just after sunset. Standing beneath the olive trees, her arms folded tightly as if holding herself together. "You should hear this from me," he said. She turned slowly. The light caught the faint bruise still visible beneath his collar, a reminder of how close she had come to losing him. Her chest tightened, but she said nothing. Dante didn't reach for her. He stayed where he was, giving her space in a way that felt deliberate. "You have a choice," he continued. "One I should have given you a long time ago." Isabella laughed softly, though there was no humor in it, "and you don't strike me as a man who believes in choices." "I didn't," he admitted, "until I almost didn't come back." The honesty in his voice made her look at him more closely. He seemed different, not weaker, but stripped of something unnecessary. Pride, perhaps, or certainty. "What kind of choice?" she asked. "You can stay," Dante said. "Here, with me, with him. Not as a prisoner, not as someone trapped by circumstance. You stay because you choose to." He paused, letting the words settle. "Or you leave." The second option hit harder than she expected. "Leave," she repeated. "I'll arrange everything," he said calmly. "A new identity, a place no one can touch you, protection for life for you and for Danny. You won't need to look over your shoulder ever again." Her breath caught. She had dreamed of this. For years, she had imagined a clean escape, a future where fear didn't dictate every step. And now he was offering it freely, without condition. "What's the catch?" she asked. "There isn't one," Dante said. "Except that if you go without me." And the truth of it settled heavily between them. Isabella looked past him, toward the house glowing softly in the distance. Inside, her son slept peacefully, unaware that his entire future balanced on a decision his mother hadn't yet made. She felt the familiar pull to run, to choose safety untainted by blood, but she also felt the weight of everything that had changed. "I won't keep you here because I'm afraid," Dante continued quietly, "and I won't let you stay because you feel guilty. This has to be real." Isabella's throat tightened. "And if I choose to stay, then I stop pretending this is temporary," he said. "I stop keeping one foot out the door. I commit to you, to him, completely." She searched his face, looking for hesitation, for the arrogance she knew so well. Instead, she saw resolve edged with vulnerability. This was not a negotiation. It was a surrender of a different kind. She went inside without answering. Danny's room was dim, the nightlight casting soft shapes across the walls. He slept sprawled across the bed, one arm flung over a stuffed animal. His face relaxed in a way that still surprised her. Isabella sat beside him, brushing a curl from his forehead, committing the moment to memory. Here. He was safe. Here. He was loved by both of them. But what kind of love was this? She imagined another life, a small house somewhere quiet. No guards, no guns, no whispers of violence in the night. She imagined Danny growing up without knowing the weight of his father's name. It was tempting, achingly so. Yet, even as she pictured it, something felt incomplete. She knew the truth she had tried to deny Dante's absence would leave a wound that no amount of safety could heal. When she returned to the garden, Dante was still there, exactly where she had left him. "I thought you'd already decided," he said softly. "So did I," she replied. "Turns out, it's not that simple." She walked closer, stopping just in front of him. "If I leave," she said, "I'll always wonder if I took something from him that he needed, a father who shows up, a man who would burn the world to protect him." "And if you stay," Dante said, "you live with the consequences of who I am." "Yes." She agreed. "That's the part that terrifies me." Dante nodded. "It should." She met his gaze steadily. But what terrifies me more is teaching my son to run every time life becomes dangerous." The words surprised them both. Isabella exhaled slowly, feeling something settle into place. "I've been running for so long," she continued. "I told myself it was for him. Maybe part of it was because I was afraid to stand still and choose something real." Dante didn't interrupt. He didn't reach for her. He let her come to her own conclusion, even as the tension between them stretched thin. "I won't stay because you're powerful," she said, "or because this house is safe. I'll stay because when I imagine my future, you're in it and so is he." Something flickered across Dante's face then, raw and unguarded. He closed the distance between them, stopping just short of touching her. "And if one day you change your mind," he asked, "then I'll leave," Isabella said. Not in fear, not in secret, but by choice. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "That's all I've ever wanted." She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his without hesitation. The gesture felt deliberate, irrevocable. "I'm staying," she said. Dante exhaled slowly, as if releasing a breath he'd been holding for years. He didn't pull her into an embrace. He didn't claim her with urgency. He simply held her hand, grounding both of them in the gravity of what had just been decided. Inside the house, Danny slept on, unaware that his mother had just chosen a life forged not by escape, but by courage. Outside, the night stretched wide and uncertain, filled with threats yet to come. Isabella felt fear. Yes, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was tempered by clarity. She had looked at her son. She had looked at the man who had once been her nightmare and had become her safest place. And for the first time, she wasn't running toward or away from anything. She was standing still, choosing her future. The truth did not arrive loudly. It slipped in through routine, disguised as normalcy, hidden behind familiar faces and trusted voices. Isabella sensed it before anyone said a word. The house felt wrong again, not tense like before, but unsettled, as if something poisonous had been introduced quietly and left to spread. Guards exchanged looks too quickly. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Dante became distant in a way she recognized, not from fear, but from calculation. The betrayal came from within. It was Marco. The name fell like a stone when Dante finally spoke it aloud. Late one night in the study, his voice stripped of warmth. Marco had been with him for years, loyal, efficient, trusted enough to stand between Danny and gunfire in the bakery, trusted enough to know schedules, routes, vulnerabilities, and trusted enough to sell that knowledge to the wrong people. "He didn't sell you," Dante said grimly. "He sold our son." The words hollowed Isabella out. She felt cold spread through her chest, sharp and merciless. "Is Danny in danger?" she asked, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Yes," Dante replied, "but not here, not yet." Not yet was worse than an immediate threat. It meant planning, it meant patience. It meant men waiting for the right moment to strike where it would hurt most. Dante moved quickly after that, tightening security, changing patterns, ordering men he trusted absolutely to stay close. Isabella watched it all, absorbing every detail with an intensity that surprised even her. She no longer wanted ignorance. The opportunity came unexpectedly. Danny's tutor called in sick. A substitute was sent instead. Someone new, someone who smiled too carefully and asked too many questions. Isabella felt the shift instantly. While Dante was tied up in meetings, she made a decision that would have terrified her weeks ago. She followed the man. She waited until Danny was settled with his lesson, then excused herself, slipping down corridors she had learned by heart. Her pulse hammered as she moved, but her steps were steady. She overheard the whispered phone call near the service stairs. The hushed Italian murmured into a burner phone. She didn't understand every word, but she understood enough. They were planning to take Danny, not from the house, from the car, from routine, from trust. Isabella didn't run to find Dante. She went to her son. Her heart pounded as she entered the study where Danny sat, coloring quietly. "Danny," she said softly, kneeling in front of him. "We're going to play a game." His eyes lit up. What kind of game? A quiet one, she said, smiling even as fear burned through her veins. You remember what Dad taught you about not being afraid? He nodded solemnly. Good, she whispered. Then I need you to listen very carefully. She moved him through the hidden passages Dante had shown her once, never thinking she would use them alone. Her hands shook, but her mind was clear. She contacted Dante only once Danny was secure. Her message short and precise. Betrayal confirmed. Plan compromised? Child safe. When Dante arrived, fury radiated off him like heat. But it wasn't the fury she expected, it was pride. You didn't wait, he said quietly, cupping her face once they were alone, his thumb brushing away the tears she hadn't realized had fallen. You didn't freeze. I couldn't. Isabella replied. Running wouldn't have saved him this time. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Marco was intercepted before he could act, cornered by men who had once called him brother. He confessed without resistance. Money, leverage, fear, all the usual excuses. Dante listened without expression. When it was over, the threat was gone, but something else had changed. Later, as dawn crept over the estate, Dante stood with Isabella on the balcony, the world quiet beneath them. You walked into the dark, he said. For him, for us. She corrected. He studied her as if seeing her for the first time. You're not the woman who ran anymore. Yeah. Isabella looked out at the horizon, the fear still present, but no longer dominant. No, she said, I'm not. The final truth settled between them, heavy and undeniable. She had chosen this world, and she was no longer afraid of facing it head on. There was no perfect ending, no sudden redemption, no world miraculously cleansed of blood and danger. The gates of the estate still stood tall. The guards still carried weapons. Dante Ferretti was still a man whose name carried weight and consequence in places Isabella would never fully see. The difference lay not in the world around them, but in the quiet, irreversible changes within. Morning came softly now. Danny ate breakfast at the kitchen table, feet swinging beneath his chair, asking questions about homework and swimming lessons and whether his parents would both be there for dinner. Isabella answered him with practiced calm, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, grounding herself in the ordinary miracle of routine. Dante watched from across the room, coffee untouched, his attention fixed not on his phone, not on the outside world, but on the small domestic scene unfolding in front of him. This was what survival looked like. Not victory, not peace, just continuity. Dante had begun to change in ways that were almost invisible to anyone else. He spoke less, listened more. He no longer gave orders about Isabella's movements without asking. Decisions were discussed, argued over, sometimes delayed, not because he lacked control, but because he was learning restraint. It was not weakness. It was discipline of a different kind, harder than violence had ever been. Isabella noticed it in the smallest moments. The way he stopped himself from reaching for her wrist when fear flared, the way he asked, quietly, "What do you think?" instead of assuming he already knew. The way he let Danny make mistakes, scrape knees, learn limits without immediately trying to eliminate every possible threat. A man like Dante did not change overnight. He learned, and Isabella, in turn, learned what it meant to stay without surrendering herself. She no longer flinched at raised voices. She no longer mistook protection for possession. When fear surfaced, she faced it directly, naming it, stripping it of its power. She stood beside Dante, not behind him, not beneath him, and when she disagreed, she said so plainly, without apology, and they argued, they made mistakes, they hurt each other without meaning to, but they stayed. One evening, after Danny had fallen asleep with a book on his chest, Isabella and Dante stood together on the terrace. The night was calm, the air cool against their skin, the city lights shimmered in the distance, indifferent to the lives unfolding beneath them. I used to think love meant control, Dante said quietly. Keeping what matters close enough that it could never be taken, Isabella didn't interrupt. She had learned when to let silence do the work. And then I realized, he continued, that the tighter I held on, the more I was destroying the very thing I wanted to protect. She turned to face him. And now I know love is choosing restraint. He said, every day. The admission carried weight. Dante Ferretti did not offer confessions lightly. Isabella stepped closer, close enough that their shoulders brushed, not seeking reassurance, simply sharing space. I used to think loving you meant losing myself, she replied, accepting a world I didn't want. And now, he asked, and now I know it means standing inside it without disappearing. They didn't kiss, not then, and the intimacy between them no longer required proof. Time moved forward, not dramatically, but steadily. Threats were handled before they reached the gates. Enemies learned to keep their distance. Danny grew stronger, kinder, curious about the world in ways that frightened and delighted them both. He knew his father was powerful, but he also knew his mother's strength, and he learned early that fear was something to understand, not obey. On a quiet afternoon, Isabella watched Dante teach Danny to repair a broken chess piece. Their heads bent together in concentration. There was patience there, gentleness, a man learning to build instead of destroy. Her chest tightened not with fear this time, but with something softer, more enduring, survival. She realized was not about escaping the fire, it was about learning how to live after the flames. Later that night, Isabella and Dante finally shared the same bed, not out of desperation, not out of fear of losing each other, but out of choice. They lay side by side, close but unguarded, the weight of everything they had endured resting between them like a shared language. Dante's hand found hers, not claiming, not demanding, simply there. We're still standing, he murmured. Yes, Isabella said, we are. They were not heroes. They were not saved. They were two people who had been broken by different wars and had chosen, against all odds, to build something fragile and real from the wreckage. A man learning to love without ownership. A woman who no longer ran from darkness, but walked through it with her eyes open, and a child who slept peacefully between those truths, unaware that he was the reason two damaged souls had survived each other. There was no perfect ending, only this. They were still here. They had chosen each other, and for now, that was enough.